Under the midnight moon of Georgia, the fields were silent, until the hounds howled. They were trained to hunt down runaways, to tear flesh and spill blood. But that night the dogs turned. Not on the slave they were sent to kill, but on the man who held their chains. This is the forgotten story of Peter, the slave who turned his master's most brutal weapon into his own path to freedom. The year was somewhere in the early 1800s, deep in the American South. Georgia was a land of shadows and whispers, where the wealth of cotton fields was bought with blood and chains. For those born into slavery, every breath was borrowed, every step watched, every night stalked by the overseer's cruelty. On plantations across Georgia, the nights belonged not to the enslaved, but to the dogs. Huge, snarling beasts bred for one purpose, to hunt men. Their baying cries could freeze the blood of any runaway who dared to seek freedom. To the enslaved, they were monsters with fangs, shadows given form, nightmares made flesh. To the overseers, they were tools, weapons sharper than any whip, and among those overseers was a man whose name is long forgotten, but whose cruelty carved itself into the memory of those he tormented. He trusted his dogs more than his own family. He fed them meat while slaves went hungry. He taught them to kill on command, to rip the courage out of men before their bodies. But in the silence of that world of chains, one man listened. His name was Peter. Not much is written about Peter in history books, because history rarely cared to write about men like him. His name surfaces only in whispers, fragments, tales passed down through generations of enslaved families, a story too dangerous to keep alive openly, yet too powerful to let die. Peter was not a large man. He did not tower over others or wield great physical strength. What set him apart was something else. Patience, intelligence, the kind of quiet fire that smolders in the soul of a man who has been pushed past breaking. He had watched year after year as the dogs were unleashed on men and women who sought freedom. He had heard their screams carried across the night fields, followed by the silence of death. And in that silence, Peter began to plan. Every night, while others prayed only to survive until dawn, Peter studied. He studied the dogs, the way they moved, the way they sniffed, the way they followed commands. He watched how the overseer held the leash, how his voice cut through the night like a whip, how the animals obeyed without question. The plantation was a world of patterns, and Peter understood patterns better than most. The overseer thought he controlled the dogs, but Peter began to see something different. The dogs had instincts stronger than any man's command. Hunger, loyalty, fear, those were the true chains binding them. If one could learn to touch those chains, one could break them. To the overseer, the dogs were nothing but beasts. To Peter, they became a language of growls, movements, subtle signs. He learned when they were restless, when they were calm, when they trusted, and when they doubted. He noticed how a slight change in tone could make them hesitate, how the smell of certain foods made their heads turn, how fear of pain could override obedience. All of this he learned in silence. He told no one, not even those he trusted most, because secrets were dangerous, and one whisper in the wrong ear could mean the whip, the dogs, or worse. For years, Peter hid his fire. Outwardly, he was obedient, invisible, a shadow among shadows. But within, he carried a plan that would require timing, precision, and above all, the moon, because it was always under the moonlight that the overseer hunted. The night hunts were spectacles of terror. Whenever a slave dared to escape, the overseer would gather his dogs, unleash them into the dark, and let the howls announce the beginning of the chase. The plantation would shiver as the baying carried over the fields, each cry a reminder of what awaited those who dreamed of freedom. But Peter's dream was different. He did not want to run. He wanted to turn the very terror of the plantation against its master. And so he waited. He waited for the night when the overseer would once again call his dogs, snap their leashes, and set them loose under the moon. That night came sooner than expected. A young boy, barely 17, had tried to run. His name is lost to history like so many others, but his courage gave Peter the chance he had been waiting for. The overseer, drunk with anger, unleashed his hounds. The boy fled into the fields, his heart no doubt pounding louder than the dog's howls, and Peter followed. Not openly, not recklessly, but like a shadow slipping into the dark. He had no weapon, no gun, no blade, But he carried with him the knowledge he had gathered, the years of observation, the unyielding patience of a man who had nothing left to lose. As the moon rose higher, the fields echoed with the thunder of paws, the snapping of branches, the overseer's furious commands. The dogs raced ahead, their noses low to the ground, their bodies quivering with bloodlust. But Peter knew something the overseer did not. The dogs' hunger was not only for flesh, it was for dominance, for leadership, for freedom of their own. And in the chaos of the hunt, leadership could shift. Somewhere between the boys' ragged breaths and the overseer's curses, Peter stepped into the moonlight. His figure was still, his voice calm, his presence steady. And for the first time, the dogs hesitated. The overseer roared at them, cracking his whip. But in that hesitation lay the seed of rebellion. The night was no longer his. It belonged to Peter. The moonlight painted the fields in silver, shadows dancing across rows of tall grass. The overseer's boots pounded the ground, whip in hand, as he barked orders. His breath steamed in the night air, his voice carrying rage and arrogance. "Go! Tear him apart!" he shouted, his commands sharp as the lash of his whip. The dogs surged forward, their muscles rippling under dark fur, teeth gleaming like knives. Their howls tore through the night, echoing across the plantation like a dirge of death. To the boy running ahead, those sounds were more terrifying than the overseer's voice. Each cry was a promise of blood, of shredded flesh, of freedom crushed beneath fangs. But then, a pause, not long, not enough for the overseer to notice at first. Just a flicker of hesitation in the lead hound, a subtle turn of its head toward the figure stepping from the shadows. Peter. His face was calm, unreadable. His steps were measured, slow, deliberate. He did not run. He did not scream. He simply stood where the moonlight struck his figure, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes locked on the dogs. The overseer snarled, furious. "Get back, boy! You'll be next if you don't move." But Peter did not move. He spoke instead, not loudly, not with force, but with a tone the dogs had never heard from the overseer. A tone not of anger but of control, steady, low, commanding without cruelty. The dogs froze. Their ears twitched, their growls faltered, confusion rippling through their bodies. The overseer raised his whip high and cracked it into the night. "Go, do as I say." The crack split the air. The dogs flinched, but they did not surge forward. Their noses lifted, sniffing the night, caught between the overseer's rage and the strange calm radiating from Peter. Peter knew this moment was fragile. The animals stood at a crossroads, their instincts clashing with years of training. He had studied this hesitation, prepared for it, waited for it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he crouched low, bringing himself to their level. His hand brushed against the earth. His breath steadied. He made a sound, soft, throaty, a mimicry of the sounds he'd heard mothers use to quiet restless pups. The lead hound tilted its head. For the boy who had fled, it was a miracle. The pack that had been his death sentence was suddenly no longer chasing him. He stumbled into the woods, too terrified to question why, too desperate to stop running. But for Peter, this was the true beginning. The overseer's fury ignited. His face twisted in disbelief. He rushed forward, striking his whip at the dogs themselves. "Obey me, damn you!" The whip lashed across fur. The animals yelped, recoiling in pain. But pain, Peter knew, was dangerous. Pain did not always breed obedience. Sometimes it bred rebellion. And in that moment of confusion, of fear, of pain inflicted by the very hand that claimed ownership over them, the dogs wavered. Their growls deepened, shifting in tone. No longer the growl of hunters. The growl of beasts reconsidering who truly held power. Peter's eyes never left them. His hand moved subtly, offering a scent he had hidden in the folds of his clothing. Scraps of dried meat, stolen and saved over weeks, carried close to his body until the dogs knew the smell as well as their own breath. The overseer shouted again, his voice cracking with panic. This was not the hunt he had commanded. This was not obedience. This was betrayal, and betrayal terrified men like him. He swung his whip at Peter, but the strike never landed. The lead dog lunged, not at the runaway, not at Peter, but at the whip itself. Teeth clamped down on leather. The overseer staggered back, shock splintering his fury. The other dogs surged, confusion exploding into chaos. Some snapped at each other, some barked wildly, their eyes flashing between the overseer and Peter. The order of the hunt was broken. The chain of command had cracked. Peter stood tall, his hand outstretched, his voice low and steady. "Here," he whispered, though his words were not for the overseer. They were for the pack, and the pack listened. The overseer stumbled, shouting in rage, his whip useless in his hand. His authority, once unquestioned, was crumbling under the very creatures he had believed loyal only to him. His boots slid in the damp earth as he swung wildly, desperate to reassert dominance. But the sound of his voice no longer held the same power. It rang hollow, filled with panic instead of command. The dogs sensed it. Animals always did. They smelled fear sharper than blood, heard the cracks in a man's voice clearer than any whip crack. The lead hound growled, the deep rumble vibrating through the still night air. Another hound joined, lips curling back to expose gleaming fangs. Their bodies lowered, muscles coiled like springs, eyes no longer fixed on the shadows of runaways but on the very man they had once obeyed. The overseer's whip lashed again, frantic, desperate. Leather struck against fur, leaving a red welt. The hound yelped, but instead of retreating, it snapped its jaws with fury. The overseer reeled backward, disbelief flashing across his face. These were his hounds, his trained beasts, his weapons. They weren't supposed to betray him, but they weren't betraying. They were choosing. Peter stood motionless a few yards away, every muscle tight, every breath calculated. He knew this was the moment that could decide everything. If the dogs turned back toward him, he would be ripped apart before he could take a second step. But if they turned fully on the overseer, if the balance tipped completely, then the night belonged to him. The overseer tried to recover, bellowing like a madman. "Down, down, curse you!" But his voice cracked. He was no longer a master, but a man begging beasts to remember loyalty they no longer felt. The dogs advanced, their growls a chorus of rebellion. The overseer swung his whip in circles, a flimsy shield. Sweat poured down his temples. For the first time in his life, he felt hunted. And then it happened. The lead hound lunged. The whip lashed across the air but missed. Fangs sank into cloth and flesh, tearing through his arm. The overseer screamed, the sound slicing through the night like a blade. The other dogs surged forward. Years of training, of beatings, of forced obedience collapsed in an instant. The leash of fear had broken, and what spilled out was rage. Rage of animals used, abused, driven beyond their instincts into brutality, now turned back upon their master. Peter watched, eyes wide, his heart hammering. The overseer collapsed beneath the weight of snarling bodies, his screams drowned in the frenzy of growls and tearing. The whip fell from his hand, trampled into the dirt, no longer a symbol of power, but a discarded relic. Blood darkened the soil. The overseer writhed, kicking, clawing, his voice shrill with terror. "Help me! Somebody!" His words were choked off as jaws clamped down on his throat. The field was alive with the sounds of violence. Snarls, yelps, the wet tearing of flesh. The overseer's cries grew weaker, fading into gurgles. The man who had commanded life and death with a flick of his whip was now reduced to nothing more than prey. Peter did not move to stop it. He did not turn away. For years, he and countless others had endured the overseer's cruelty, had been beaten beneath that whip, had lived in terror of those very hounds. Now justice, raw and merciless, was devouring him alive. The dogs tore until the overseer no longer screamed, until the body beneath them was nothing but a mangled heap. And then, silence. The frenzy slowed. The growls subsided. The pack stood over what remained of their master, panting, chests heaving, muzzles red with blood. Their eyes turned one by one toward Peter. This was the moment. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to disappear into the dark before they turned on him too. But Peter stood his ground. He met their gaze steady, unflinching. His hands did not shake. His breath did not falter. He raised one hand slowly, palm outward, and spoke. His voice was low, firm, a voice not of fear, but of command. Enough. The word cut through the night, not as a shout, but as a certainty. The lead hound's ears twitched. It stepped forward, sniffing the air heavy with blood. Its nose brushed Peter's hand. Instead of snapping, it paused. Peter's scent carried the memory of the scraps he had offered, the patience he had shown, the presence that had never carried the sting of a whip. The hound lowered its head. One by one, the others followed. The pack that had torn its master apart now stood in a circle around Peter, not attacking, not growling, waiting. For the first time, they had a choice, and they chose him. Peter's chest rose and fell with a trembling breath, relief and disbelief mingling in his veins. The overseer's body lay twisted and broken in the dirt. His reign ended not by rebellion of slaves, not by some outside force, but by the very beasts he had used to enforce terror. Peter had taken the overseer's sharpest weapon and made it his own. But he knew the night was not yet over. Freedom was not won in one moment of blood. There would be consequences. The plantation would wake to the overseer's absence, to the silence where once his voice had ruled. The dogs would be feared, suspected, hunted. And Peter would need to decide what came next. Would he flee into the wilderness, trusting the bond he had forged with the pack? Would he return, blending into the shadows of the enslaved, pretending innocence while whispers spread? Or would he rise, seizing this moment to strike deeper, to carve out a path no one could ignore? The moon hung high, its cold light washing over the field of death. Peter stood among the dogs, his heart pounding with the knowledge that everything had changed, and for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of power shift into his hands. The overseer was gone. The pack was his, and the night belonged to Peter. The first light of dawn crept over the Georgia fields, painting the sky in pale streaks of gray and gold. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, of cotton stalks heavy with dew, and something else, something metallic, something sharp. Blood. It clung to the soil, soaked into the ground where the overseer had fallen. His body lay twisted and broken, half shredded by the fury of the hounds. His whip, once the symbol of absolute control, lay useless beside him, coiled like a dead snake. The dogs stood nearby, silent now, their muzzles stained, their breaths heavy but calm. They were not restless. They were not wild. They waited, watchful, their eyes fixed on the shadows where Peter stood. For a long moment, no one came. The plantation still slumbered, unaware that its order had collapsed in the night. But dawn always wakes the world, and soon voices stirred. The first to discover the scene were the field hands sent early to prepare the day's labor. They froze in their tracks, tools slipping from their fingers as they saw the carnage. Gasps broke the morning stillness. One man crossed himself. A woman clutched her shawl tighter. None dared step closer. They knew what those dogs could do. They had seen enough torn bodies in the past to never mistake what those teeth meant. But this was different. The overseer was supposed to be untouchable. He was the master's iron hand, the one who carried the whip, who commanded obedience with fear alone. For years his presence had been as unshakable as the rising sun. And yet here he lay, broken, silenced forever. Whispers spread quickly. Within minutes the news had reached the quarters. Slaves poured out quietly, cautiously, their faces masks of disbelief and awe. Some could not hide the flicker of relief in their eyes. Others trembled, terrified of what this meant. Because order did not fall without consequence. The master's house stirred next. Doors slammed open. Boots pounded on the porch. Shouts rang out, demanding answers. Within moments, armed white men rushed toward the scene, pistols at their sides, eyes sharp with suspicion. When they reached the overseer's body, the sight stunned even them. "What in God's name?" one muttered, his voice breaking off as his gaze swept over the torn flesh, the blood, the silent circle of hounds. The master himself arrived last. His face was pale, his jaw set. He stared down at the corpse of the man who had enforced his will for so many years. The overseer had been brutal, yes, but reliable, unshakable, and now he was nothing but a shredded carcass in the dirt. How? The master demanded, his voice low and tight. Who did this? His eyes swept over the crowd of slaves, searching, accusing. Fear rippled through them. None dared speak. None dared even meet his gaze. To be suspected was to be condemned, and no one wished to invite death upon themselves. Then one of the white men pointed toward the dogs. It was them. Look at them. They're covered in blood. The master's eyes narrowed. Rage flickered in his face. They turned. The silence was heavy. Everyone knew what that meant. A dog that killed its master could never be trusted again. They would be destroyed, every one of them. But before he gave the order, something happened that made even the bravest men hesitate. The lead hound, massive and scarred, stepped forward. It did not snarl. It did not bare its teeth. It simply moved to stand between the body of the overseer and the crowd, its gaze calm but unyielding. The other dogs followed, forming a loose circle, their stance protective. The master froze. Never before had he seen his hounds behave this way. They were supposed to obey without question, to cower under command. But now they guarded. Not the body of the overseer, but the space itself. A warning. The slaves exchanged glances, silent messages passing between them. Some saw the hand of God in it, divine justice delivered at last. Others saw danger, knowing that retribution from above would fall hard and mercilessly. Peter remained in the background, unseen among the crowd. His heart pounded, not only with the memory of last night's blood, but with the weight of choices pressing against him. He had done what no slave had dared, turned the master's weapon against him. Yet now he was just one shadow among many. His face blank, his eyes lowered like the others. But inside, a storm raged. He could feel the dog's gaze flick toward him from time to time, quiet recognition burning in their eyes. They did not betray him, but their stillness, their defiance, was a living testimony of his influence. If anyone noticed the strange bond between Peter and the pack, suspicion would fall like an axe. The master's voice thundered across the field again, sharp with fury. "I want those beasts chained before noon. Starve them if you must. Break their spirit and then kill them." The men nodded, though none moved quickly. The growls of the hounds made them hesitate. The memory of the overseer's shredded body weighed heavy. Even armed, even with chains in hand, they feared the pack. Peter watched closely. Every second counted. He knew what would come. The men would eventually overcome their fear. The dogs would be chained, dragged into cages, beaten until they were nothing more than broken shells. And if that happened, his plan would end before it had truly begun. He thought of escape. The woods called to him, the thought of freedom burning like fire. With the pack by his side, he could vanish into the wilderness, carve out a life beyond the reach of the whip. But he also thought of those left behind, men, women, children, still trapped in bondage, who would suffer even harsher punishments in the wake of the overseer's death. Peter's mind raced. Freedom for one man, or rebellion for many? That question gnawed at him as the men approached the dogs with chains. The pack stiffened, lips curling, eyes narrowing. The lead hound growled, a sound so low it vibrated in Peter's chest. One of the men tried to throw a chain. The hound snapped, teeth clashing against metal, forcing the man to stumble back in terror. The crowd of slaves murmured quietly, their voices like the rustle of leaves. Fear mingled with something else. Wonder. They saw it too. The overseer had fallen, and now even the master's men trembled. Something sacred had shifted. Peter clenched his fists at his sides. He could not stand by. He could not let the animals who had granted him power be slaughtered like cattle. Not when they were more than beasts now. They were symbols. Symbols of what could happen when fear itself broke its chains. But to act was to risk everything. If he revealed himself, the master's wrath would fall on him without hesitation. The decision pressed against him like a weight. Every breath, every heartbeat told him the same truth. Moments like this did not come twice. The men lunged again with chains. The dogs barked furiously, snapping, refusing to yield. One of the men stumbled, cursing, and raised his pistol. Peter's chest tightened. A single shot would end it. And so he stepped forward. Not boldly, not with a shout, but with quiet certainty. He pushed through the cluster of slaves, his movements deliberate but calm. His heart thundered, but his face remained unreadable. The dogs saw him instantly. Their growls softened, their bodies shifting. Recognition flashed like lightning. The armed men froze. Their eyes darted between the hounds and the lone figure walking toward them. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Why weren't the dogs attacking him? Peter stopped just short of the pack. His voice was steady, carrying across the tense silence. "They don't obey you." The words hung in the air like thunder. The slaves gasped softly. The white men stiffened, disbelief twisting into suspicion. Peter raised his hand slowly, palm outward. The lead hound pressed its blood-stained muzzle against it, calm, obedient. The crowd erupted in whispers. Fear, awe, shock. The overseer's killers now bent their heads to Peter. The master's face went pale, then red with fury. His voice shook with rage. "What trick is this?" But deep down he already knew it wasn't a trick. He saw it in the dog's eyes, in the silence of the crowd, in the calm defiance of the man before him. Control had shifted, and nothing terrified him more. The silence that followed was heavier than chains. The hounds sat at Peter's feet like guardians, their chests rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The men who had come with iron collars and pistols now stood frozen, uncertain whether to strike or flee. The master's face twisted, rage battling disbelief. He had spent years breaking men, breaking animals, breaking wills. Yet here was a slave, standing unchained, commanding the beasts that had once been his most brutal weapon. "You," the master spat, his voice trembling. "Step away from them, now!" Peter did not move. His eyes stayed on the dogs, his hand resting lightly on the head of the lead hound. Inside, his body trembled with adrenaline, but his face remained calm, almost unreadable. "They won't obey you anymore," Peter said quietly. But the words carried like a blade cutting through the still air. A ripple went through the crowd of slaves. Murmurs rose, hushed but urgent. Some looked terrified, glancing toward the master as if waiting for the whip or the gun to fall. Others looked at Peter with something else. Hope, fragile but alive. The master raised his whip, the leather curling in the air. He cracked it toward Peter, but before the lash could fall, the lead hound leapt forward with a savage snarl. The whip fell uselessly to the ground as the dog's teeth closed on it, ripping it from the master's hand. Gasps erupted. The master staggered back, his authority unraveling before their eyes. The slaves had seen overseers beaten before. They had seen whips raised and blood spilled. But never had they seen the power of the whip itself broken, shattered by the very beast meant to enforce it. Peter's heart thundered, but his voice was steady as he spoke again. "Your tools don't work anymore. Not your whip, not your dogs, not your fear." The master's lips curled in hatred. "You think you can take my place? You think you can lead them? You're nothing. You're still mine." But his words rang hollow. The slaves weren't looking at him anymore. Their eyes were on Peter, on the dogs that guarded him, on the living proof that the balance of power could shift. The men with pistols hesitated. Their fingers twitched on the triggers, but the growls of the pack kept them frozen. Every step closer could be their last. Peter understood what was happening. The moment was fragile, like a flame flickering in the wind. It could die in an instant, smothered by bullets or fear. But if he fed it, if he dared to let it burn, it could ignite something no master could ever control. He turned, slowly, his gaze sweeping over the rows of slaves gathered in the field. Their faces were tired, scarred, worn by years of labor and punishment. Yet behind their fear something stirred. A spark, Peter spoke, his words low but heavy with meaning. "They think we're animals. They think we'll never rise. But the chains can break. Even fear can break." The slaves stared, silence holding them still. The master shouted, spitting orders at the men with pistols. "Shoot him! Kill the beast, now!" But the dogs moved before the men could act, growling, circling, their eyes glowing with a wild, dangerous loyalty. The men backed away, fear plain on their faces. For the first time, the master's commands went unanswered. The dogs had chosen, and so had Peter. He stood taller, the weight of his fear shifting into something else, resolve. For years he had hidden in the shadows, surviving. But survival was no longer enough. That night by the moon, when the dogs first turned, Peter had felt freedom brush against his skin like a whisper. Now it was roaring in his chest. He had not sought to lead. But leadership had found him, and deep down, the master knew it. The crack in his control had widened. The whip was gone, the dogs were lost, and now the slaves were listening to another voice. The old order was dying, and Peter was the one holding the match. The master's face had gone pale, his lips curling with fury, but his eyes betrayed something he could never admit aloud: fear. For the first time in his life, he was not in control. Peter stood steady, the hounds at his side, the slaves behind him watching. No chains bound him, no whip lashed across his back. He was just a man, yet in that moment he was more powerful than the master who claimed to own him. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable. The men with pistols still hovered uncertainly, trapped between the master's shouted orders and the dog's deadly growls. And then a sound broke the silence. It was soft at first, a murmur, a whisper. One slave, an older man with scars that ran across his face like rivers, spoke. "He speaks true. Fear can break. The words fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. Other voices followed, timid at first, then stronger. Murmurs turned to sentences, sentences into chants, and soon the air was alive with the sound of voices rising against silence. The master's rage erupted.
"Quiet, all of you!"
"Quiet or you'll—" But his words drowned beneath the rising chorus. For years the slaves had been forced to keep their voices low, their cries swallowed by fields and forests. Now those voices joined together, filling the air like thunder. Peter felt it wash over him, a force stronger than the dogs, stronger than chains. The crowd was waking up, yet he knew this was only the beginning. The master was not beaten. Not yet. With a trembling hand, the master pointed at Peter. "Seize him! Kill the dogs if you must!" The men hesitated. Their eyes darted between Peter, the hounds, and the sea of slaves now standing closer together, no longer bowing, no longer silent. One man lifted his pistol, but his hand shook violently. Before he could fire, one of the younger slaves stepped forward, his body tense, his eyes blazing. In a flash, he struck the man's wrist, knocking the weapon to the ground. Gasps filled the air. That act, that single act of defiance, was more dangerous than any words. It broke the unspoken rule that no one dared touch a white man. The overseer's replacement shouted, his face red. But his voice wavered. The crowd was no longer afraid. Peter's heart raced. He hadn't expected this, hadn't asked for it. But now standing here, he understood. A fire once lit could not be smothered so easily. He raised his voice, not in a shout, but in steady, clear tones. "You see them. They bleed like us. They fear like us. And now they tremble before us." The crowd's murmur grew louder, swelling into something fierce, unstoppable. The master staggered back, his power slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time, the slaves were not waiting for his command. They were moving, shifting, their bodies no longer bent in submission but standing upright. Shoulders squared, the dogs paced restlessly at Peter's side, their eyes fixed on the trembling men with pistols. Peter knew the moment of decision had come. There could be no turning back. Either the slaves would rise, or the master would crush them with all the brutality he could summon. He took a step forward, his voice rising above the chaos. "We are not shadows. We are not beasts. Tonight, the chains break," the crowd roared, a sound that shook the fields and the men who stood against them. The master screamed, his face twisted with rage and terror. "Shoot him! Shoot them all!" But the men didn't move. The dogs growled, the slaves advanced, and the fragile empire of fear collapsed one heartbeat at a time. Peter stood at the center of it all, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the man who had claimed to own his life. This was no longer about survival. It was no longer about one man's freedom. This was the birth of rebellion. The roar of the crowd echoed like thunder rolling across the fields. For years, those voices had been forced into silence, beaten down by chains and whips. Now they rose together, not in pain but in defiance. The master staggered backward, his fine clothes drenched in sweat, his trembling hand pointing uselessly at the sea of faces before him. "You'll all hang for this. Every one of you! Do you hear me? The law will see you burned." But the words no longer carried the weight they once had. The fear that had kept the slaves in check was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of their own awakening. Peter stood firm at the center, the dogs flanking him like shadows of vengeance. Their growls rolled low and steady, promising blood if a single weapon was raised. One of the overseer's men tried to push through the crowd, pistol in hand, but he was shoved back by the slaves. His weapon clattered to the ground, swallowed by dozens of hands before it could be reclaimed. The master's eyes widened. He had never seen them resist, not like this. They had always bowed, always yielded. But now they were advancing step by step, and he was the one being cornered. "Stop," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Do you fools think you can win? Soldiers will come. Militias will come. They'll cut you down like dogs." But his threats sounded hollow, even to himself. Peter's chest rose and fell as he looked at the crowd. Their faces glowed with something raw, something dangerous. Belief. He hadn't asked to lead them, but the truth was undeniable. In their eyes, he had become more than a man. He was a spark, and sparks could set fire to fields far larger than this one. He raised his hand, palm open. The crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on him. The dogs sat, alert but waiting, as if sensing what would come next. Peter's voice rang out, calm but powerful. You've beaten us, starved us, hunted us. You've chained our bodies, but you never owned our souls. Tonight, he paused, his gaze locking on the trembling master. Tonight, we take them back. A cheer erupted, raw and unrestrained. The slaves surged forward, their chains clanking like war drums. Some grabbed tools, hoes, axes, anything they could wield. Others simply clenched their fists, their fury ready to spill. The overseer's men panicked. 2 dropped their weapons and fled, sprinting toward the stables. Another tried to fire his pistol, but before he could aim, the dogs leapt, dragging him to the ground in a whirlwind of snarls and screams. Blood splattered the dirt. The sight sent shockwaves through the crowd, not of fear but of exhilaration. The balance had shifted completely. The master fell back onto his knees, the reality of his crumbling empire sinking into his bones. His voice was little more than a desperate rasp. You'll damn us all. Peter stepped closer, the hounds at his side. His shadow stretched long in the torchlight, and for the first time he looked down on the man who had once towered over him. No, Peter said softly. You damned yourself the day you believed fear would last forever. The master's eyes darted wildly, searching for some last vestige of control. But there was none. Not in his men, not in the slaves, not even in the dogs. Everything had slipped beyond his grasp, the plantation, the world he had built unbroken. Backs and spilled blood was burning without. Fire, and Peter knew this, was only the beginning. The night of rebellion had begun. The night blazed with sound, shouts, snarls, the crash of boots against dirt. The air itself felt alive, trembling with the force of a rebellion long buried. Peter stood at the center of it all, the hounds circling him like shadows of justice. Their growls blended with the roar of the crowd, a chorus that shook the ground beneath their feet. For centuries, the master's house had been built on silence. Now that silence had been torn apart. The master stumbled, his fine coat torn, his face pale and wild. He had once been the unshakable figure in every slave's nightmare, the one whose word was law, whose whip was gospel. But now he was small, swallowed by the sea of people he had believed too broken to rise. His voice cracked as he shouted, You'll all burn for this. The militia will tear you apart. The world will never let you win. But his words were drowned out by the chorus of voices that rose around him. No more, no more. The overseer's last loyal men tried to hold their ground, but they were swept aside, disarmed, shoved back, their pistols ripped from their hands. The slaves who had once bowed now stood taller than ever, their chains not symbols of submission but of defiance. They rattled them in unison, turning them into drums of war. Peter stepped forward. His heart pounded like a hammer against his ribs, but his face was steady. The dogs followed, their blood-stained muzzles glinting in the torchlight. The crowd parted for him, all eyes fixed on his silhouette. He stopped before the master. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The 2 men, one who had ruled through terror and one who had survived it, stood face to face. The master tried to muster his old authority. His lips curled, his voice bitter with venom. You think you're free? You think they'll follow you? You're nothing but a slave. The words were cut short by the growl of the lead hound. Its teeth bared, its body coiled, it was ready to strike. Peter raised his hand and the dog froze, obedient to him alone. The silence was heavy, the crowd waiting. This was the moment that would decide everything, the moment fear either returned or was broken forever. Peter's voice was low but unshakable. You built your world on chains, but chains rust, and tonight... He glanced at the crowd, at their faces shining with firelight, at the tools-turned weapons gripped in their hands. Tonight they break. The crowd erupted. A thunderous cry that shook the very earth. The master fell to his knees, trembling, his authority shattered. He looked around wildly, but no help came. His men had fled or fallen. His hounds had betrayed him. His slaves had risen. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone.